I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies here at Harvard. Welcome to our bi-weekly research seminar series. Today we are excited to have Maria Atuesta with us. I will introduce her in a second. Just before we start with Maria, I would like to give a shout out to some of our upcoming events. We are having the Dunlop Lecture. I'm looking for my notes over here. The Dunlop Lecture on October 13th with Michael Maltzin giving a lecture on architecture as a response to homelessness, with responses from Mike Alvarez, who was the CEO of Skid Row Housing in LA, and Helen Young from LA Mas, which will be a great event. We're really excited to host that. That's at 7:30 in the evening, and we'll have a discussion which will be moderated by Dean Sarah Whiting from the GSD. And then on October 15th, we'll have our next of our weekly seminars that will be Rent Eats First. Will feature work done by Joint Center researchers presenting Alex Herman and work he's joined with Whitney Ergodobricki and Sophia Wadeen, looking at the trade-off people make when they pay rent and what the impact is on the rest of their spending and their well-being. So I hope you join us for both of those events. So today, in a moment, I'll turn it over to Maria for her presentation. She'll present for half an hour or so, and then we'll come back and we'll have a Q&A with our folks watching at home using the Q&A feature. So please present your questions through that quick Q&A, and I will curate them and present them to Maria. So let me turn it over to Maria now. So one second. So today's talk, Public Housing, Public Aid, and Collective Reparations in Colombia, is work that she is doing for her dissertation. She's a doctoral student at Harvard in urban planning. She's also, we're proud to say, a Meyer Fellow here at the Joint Center. We provide a modest amount of support and get to claim all her good work as for our own, which is why she's here presenting today. Maria, her work focuses on housing, social justice, and social inequality, and looks particularly at the relationship between space and social structure. Really interesting work she'll be presenting today in Colombia. So let me, without further ado, turn it over to you, Maria. I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Chris. So let me share. It's not. So thanks everyone for joining. As Chris was saying, I'm a PhD student in urban planning at the GSD. I'm finishing this year, so I will present you one chapter of my dissertation on public housing for internally displaced persons in Colombia. And before I begin, I would like to thank the Joint Center for Housing for the support that it has given me for the past 2 years, and also for the interest members have shown in reading my work and commenting on it. That's super appreciated. So for those of you who are not familiar with the context of conflict in Colombia, and also with the context of my own research, let me give you some basic information before we really start the talk. So Colombia has been under civil conflict for more than 50 years. Well, it actually, a peace agreement was signed in 2016. And as a result of this long conflict, more than 8 million persons have been displaced internally in Colombia. They have followed a pattern from rural areas to urban centers in Colombia. So what you see here is Granada, which is the city, my case study city for my whole dissertation. And in my dissertation, I do not only study public housing projects, I actually wanted to study different ways of neighborhood creation of communities of internally displaced persons. And the main forms that are created are through illegal land occupations, through what the literature has called pirate developments, which is the purchase of land that has been developed illegally by some private entrepreneur, and public housing projects, which is the topic of today's presentation. The two projects that I will be talking about are these yellow ones below. Let me see if I have a pointer. Yeah. So here's one and here's the other one. They're called Macatoa and Savannah. I spent 1 year there doing field work, doing participant observation, doing interviews and a bit of archival research. And my goal, my main methodological goal in terms of contributing to generalizable knowledge is finding situations that do not fit a rule, finding unexpected cases that make us question what we take for granted, and possibly introduce new hypotheses. So today's presentation is going to be about this question of what are the specific challenges of free housing for the collective reparation of internally displaced persons. So what do I mean by free housing? In 2012, the national government of Colombia created this program called the 100,000 free housing program. And the goal was to provide free housing to what the government called the poorest of the poor. And among the poorest of the poor, there were, of course, internally displaced persons to which the government had a debt because a constitutional debt, because many displaced persons in Colombia did not have a house. So this was the basic purpose of the program. And the government created more than 200 housing projects all around the country. So here in the center, you can see the different municipalities where a free housing project was built. Some municipalities had more than one, like the case of Granada. And these are the different housing typologies, the images around of the types of housing that was built. So for the case of large cities, housing was built mostly through this high-rise or mid-rise buildings. And for the case of small cities, you have more rows of housing units, like here below. So this is the case that I will be studying today. And something interesting about these small cities is that because the number of housing the housing units that were delivered with the free housing projects represented a larger percentage of the housing stock of these small cities, these housing projects became new neighborhoods of the city. So that's why I'm talking about, and I will talk about free housing neighborhoods. So within this set of 200 projects, I decided to focus on 2 projects in Granada. It's located in the middle, in the center of the country, where you see there. And why did I choose Granada as my case study? Well, Granada is a city of about 80,000 inhabitants that received a lot of IDPs in a short period. So in 3 decades, Granada received IDPs representing about 1/3 of the population that it had in 1990. So imagine that. So here you can see the data of the number of displaced persons arriving in Granada annually. And you can see that the number of cases start to increase rapidly in the late 1990s, and they reach a top of more than 2,500 cases in 2016. So because of this, new neighborhoods started to emerge in Granada. And it created an ideal place for me. If you remember, I wanted to study neighborhood formation as a result of the influx of IDPs. So it created an ideal place for me to study different types of neighborhood formation in the same city. Also, another reason why I chose Granada as my case study is because I wanted to get a lens from a small city, because small cities are generally understudied by the literature on IDPs worldwide. So I thought it was important. So I have given you all the basic information that I think you need to understand my case, but of course we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So let's go back to the central question of this presentation. And to remind you is, what are the specific challenges of free housing for the collective reparation of internally displaced persons in the case of Savannah and Macatoa, these are the images of each of the two neighborhoods that I'm studying. So the literature on public housing in the global south, and particularly in Latin America, in this case, has asked a fairly similar question, right, about the challenges of public housing. And the agreement in general is that with the adoption of a new model of housing provision in the 1990s throughout different Latin American nations, new problems have emerged, particularly that housing projects have been built primarily in the city peripheries, far away from the job market, many with a lack of access to public amenities, isolated from public institutions, and scholars have also identified issues of discrimination and, of course, segregation. So the two projects, Sabana and Macatoa, have the similar characteristics. So the two neighborhoods are located in the peripheries of urban Granada, and they have a concentrated poverty. So these are neighborhoods of 180 and 190 housing units. They each have more than 50% more than 50% of the population of these neighborhoods are displaced, poor displaced persons, and the rest are what the government called the poorest of the poor. So there is an issue of segregation and concentrated poverty here. But when I was living there, I found it very interesting that the residents did not seem to have the same problems or challenges that the literature generally described for me. So let me tell you why. So first, being a small city is kind of self-evident, but every neighborhood in urban Granada is less than 20 minutes bike ride to the city center. So there is not an issue of spatial isolation as you see in the literature, at least not an issue that directly affects the resident in terms of their capacity to move around. Additionally, and very surprisingly, I found that the children of residents of these neighborhoods attended many of the the elementary and high schools of the city, the same schools of the same schools that the children of the better off families used to attend. Families had also access to the same healthcare centers, and I found that in their personal phone books, they used to carry the numbers of the major and other influential politicians, which revealed to me that they were not really isolated, at least in institutional terms. And last but not least, I also found that the residents were not really discriminated against for their condition of displacement, at least in terms of their access to the job market. So in my own research in Bogota and research in big cities that I've read about, these stories are very common among displaced persons, where they are denied jobs when they reveal that they are displaced. In this case, I didn't find a single story of racial, discrimination for displacement when people wanted to access the job market. So to be fair, people have difficulties accessing the job market because there are not many jobs, but they don't feel discriminated against. So this made me wonder and try to dig deeper about what are the challenges that these communities are facing. And yes, they are facing challenges. One in particular is that I found that the residents were having a very difficult time coming together as a community. They were having a very difficult time making claims together as a community to access services from the government, to request better amenities. They were having a very difficult time getting together to solve social tensions among neighbors, and residents used to repeat over and over that there was now no social harmony in the neighborhood. And this happened in both neighborhoods. So I wonder why. And I asked my interviewees, and the response was that the government had made a mistake by bringing displaced persons from very different backgrounds, coming from different places in the country, with different customs and with a difficult experience of displacement, to live in residential proximity. They thought that was the problem. When I spoke with the local public authorities, housing authorities, they gave me the same answer. They thought there was an issue of bringing displaced persons to live closer together. When I spoke with the national authorities, again, the same argument. And these national authorities with whom I spoke, they had a responsibility to monitor all the 200 housing projects that I spoke about that are all over the country. And they revealed to me as well that these problems of social tensions were not unique of the housing projects in Granada. These social tensions were happening in many other cities in the country. So I wonder if this explanation of displacement as a cause for social tensions was a good one. I was convinced, to be honest, for a while that it was a good explanation. But then when I started doing research in informal settlements in Granada, I realized it was not really the explanation. It was actually a consequence of the problem. So of the different neighborhoods I studied in Granada, only in the free housing projects, displacement was a category used as a form of social differentiation, not in the other ones. Actually, in stark contrast to the free housing neighborhoods in informal settlements, displacement was used as a category of social unity. It was used to bring people together and make claims to the government with relative success to get access to basic amenities and public services. So why is the real reason, what is the root behind these tensions that I encounter in the free housing neighborhoods? Let me focus from now on what I think are the main factors that are causing this problem. So the first one is that there is a highly regulated environment where the rules are not really enforced. So scholars have written about this, so this is not new, that there is a highly regulated built environment in public housing projects or social housing projects is not new. But I want us to focus on the second part of the sentence, which is that the rules are not really enforced. So for those of you who are not acquainted with the literature, in public housing projects in Latin America, there are some rules residents need to adjust to. So they are not able to change their housing units in any substantial way. And they are also not allowed to have businesses at home. But when you go to these neighborhoods, everyone knows that people do not really follow the rules, even public officials. So you start seeing how people adjust their housing units to their taste. They create fences around their units, they build decks, they decorate their houses in different ways. Some of them even built second floor. Many have businesses at home. And this is fine, this flexibility is very important, but what I want us to focus here is that there is a social caveat of this informalization of the formal. And let me explain you what I mean here. So I'll give you there are plenty of examples, but I think this is the clearest. In Savannah, some residents have adopted this practice of parking their motorcycles in front of their housing unit. So there are parking slots around the project, but they think it's not safe. So they prefer to park it there where you see here in the image. On the other hand, other residents do not like this because they don't like to see bikes speeding in front of their housing units. They think it's dangerous. So they have adopted this practice of laying stones on the sidewalk to create obstacles for the drivers and force them to step down their motorbikes and walk them to their homes. This has created a lot of tension between neighbors, and I am not exaggerating. So sometimes things have become physical. So this is a problem. But instead of getting together as a community to try to solve this issue, perhaps asking public authorities to provide safer, better parking, what has happened is that residents raise this issue over and over again in these meetings that are organized by the public authorities who are in charge of monitoring the housing projects. So in these meetings, they blame the other one, right? They say driving motorcycles on the sidewalk is not legal, and the other parties say, well, laying stones on the sidewalk is not legal, and the answer from public authorities has been, well, they validate both points. They say laying stones and driving bikes on the sidewalk is illegal. But they don't really enforce the rules. So they leave residents in this normative limbo where they demand others to follow the rules that they know nobody really follows. So in this case, where regulation should be a means to help residents to solve social problems through a common social contract, it's actually exacerbating the social tensions. So it's not serving its original purpose. The second factor is that there is an institutional environment where it is not clear who gets what and why. So displaced persons who are living in the free housing units are all ingrained in this national system of aid provision because it was through the system that they got the housing unit in the first place. I will not give you, not will emphasize much on the national system, but we can talk more about it in the Q&A. But basically, there are different sorts of humanitarian aid provisions available to displaced persons, and these forms of aid provision are related, have different requirements and different, they change the amounts provided depending on some characteristics of the families. So the problem that I want to raise here, because it's good that it's a system like that, but the problem is that it has a lot of inconsistencies. So let me just give you one. As part of the system, so if you declare displacement in Colombia, you are entitled to receive a monetary reparation after 10 years after the declaration of displacement. So far is pretty good. The problem is that the policy is underfunded. So many families have not been able to receive the reparation after 10 years of displacement. How does this affect the people who live in free housing units? Let me give you an example. So Lucia, she is a mother of 3 children. She is displaced. 2 of her children have disabilities. She's a single mother, and she has been displaced for 15 years. She has not received her reparation, but she has seen how other families with 2 working parents received the reparation before her. So she wonders whether there's something fishy about it because she's a single mother, she should have been prioritized. On the other side of the spectrum, we have a case like Rosa's. So Rosa, she is in her 60s. She's also been displaced for over 10 years. She lives in a free housing unit with her husband. All her children have come of age. They have left home. They have their own jobs. And she received her reparation, her monetary reparation, which she invested most of the money in her housing unit, making it prettier. So as you can see here in the image, She has changed the cement floor, so the units are delivered with a cement floor. She has changed it and has put pretty tiles on it. She has painted the walls in white. She has decorated the kitchen. She has enclosed the housing unit with a fence. She has making it pretty. She was not expecting to get her reparation. It was a surprise for her. But she learned that she was able to sue the government in order to get it, which she did, and she got it. I asked her whether she would be willing to share this important piece of information with her neighbors, given that they had so much trouble getting their own reparations. And she said that she'd rather keep it a secret because she thinks her neighbors are envious and she feels they judge her. So what is already evident in the housing investments that she has made to her neighbors, she tries to keep it a secret. So you can see with these different examples how in some cases residents feel cheated by their neighbors, whereas in others they feel they are judged unjustly, which all doesn't adds up to not help people cooperate and come together as a community. The last factor is that there is a social environment of small cities without complex processes of urban anonymity. So let me explain you in more detail what I mean here. If you analyze the data on the trajectories of displacement in Colombia, there's an interesting trend where large cities like Bogota, where you see here on the left, have received populations from all over the country. But in the case of small cities, they have received populations mainly from their immediate vicinities, from their immediate region. In the case of Granada, here in red, most of the populations who have arrived in Granada, who have left their hometowns for Granada, come from this green area that you see here. Again, I will not emphasize on the history of this green area, but it is important to know here is that people who are migrating, they know others who are migrating with them. They are familiar with the stories of migration in their region, and they have formed their minds about what is real displacement and what is not. So how does this affect people who live in a free housing neighborhood? Well, I asked residents whether if they could change how housing had been distributed, they would have to. And the answer of some of them was, interestingly, that they would have changed how it was distributed, and they would have not prioritized displaced families, even when they were displaced. And the reason for this is not a lack of camaraderie among displaced persons, but actually something related to this history of regional displacement. So one woman told me that she used to live in this green area. And this green area is an area that is very, had a lot of coca plantations, and it was benefited by the coca boom, the coca production boom in the 1980s and 1990s. So a lot of people, she explained to me that a lot of people coming actually from cities like Granada migrated to this region to benefit from the coca economy. For her, those people who migrated to the region only to make business and then migrated back to Granada or other cities were not really displaced, because they were, for her, commuters who benefited economically. She saw how many people got a free housing unit who she thought were not really displaced persons, and she thought that was not right. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people like Fabian. So Fabian used to live in this green area selling these coca leaves to paramilitaries and FARC guerrillas, and he got displaced because the FARC found out that he was selling to both parties, so they threatened him, so he had to leave for Granada. So you could claim that he's a commuter, and he could be seen by others as not really displaced. But when you speak with Fabian, he will tell you that, well, he was displaced by violence. He used to live there, and he's entitled to a free housing unit because he's entitled to reparation. He feels judged by his neighbors, and he doesn't like the neighborhood because he thinks people are very competitive and envious. So again, you have two different stories that have social consequences, limiting social capital in these neighborhoods. Just to finish, so to sum up the factors that I've identified, so the lack of transparency of information of who gets what and why, and a social context of small cities where people are somewhat familiar with the histories of migration of others, and a highly regulated environment where rules are not really enforced, are contributing to creating what I found is displacement becoming a category of social differentiation, residents feeling compelled to embrace the appearance of poverty instead of making claims for reparation, residents having a limited capacity to make claims as a collective and access basic residential infrastructure besides housing, and a context where reparation is reconceptualized as a sort of welfare, dependency, or something fishy. Just to leave you with a couple of takeaways that I think I hope to have given you with this presentation, is that small cities face very different challenges and are understudied. That bringing people from different backgrounds and customs and with a difficult experience of displacement to live together is not necessarily a divisive factor. And then even if desired, reparation can perpetuate social tensions that should be accounted for. So with this, I'm not saying reparation is bad or the public housing is bad. No, not at all. Please don't live with that idea. It's just that it is important to acknowledge that there are specific challenges to implement such policies. So with this, I end my presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Maria. That was terrific. You put a lot on the table for us to discuss. We're already getting some questions coming in through the Q&A. So I'll take them, I guess, in order they come. The first question is from a woman, Maria Paula Celia, who worked in the government's Ministry of Housing on this program, the free housing program. And she understood the challenges of the kind of degree of chance in how housing was distributed. So she's interested in your take on, do you think there are ways in which families could be chosen to live in this housing program that could be more effective? Is there a system that would not be as one subject to chance as this one? And I might add to that, I guess, put my own spin on it too, given what you're describing about the trying to build community, is there a way in which the selection could enhance the formation of community as opposed to making it more difficult?
Yeah, right. So yeah, that's a very difficult question because it's very easy to criticize, but difficult to propose things, but it's a great question. So something that I found, I was going to speak about it in this presentation, but for the interest of time, I didn't, but I think it is important to mention now, is that so the national government created this very technocratic scheme, and I'm sure Maria Paula knows about it, to select beneficiaries. So they created this very technocratic list of who were the poorest of the poor, based on income databases and databases on displacement, and they delivered these databases to so long story short, to local authorities to conduct lotteries among all the potential beneficiaries, and people would go to these lotteries, and some people would be selected by would be lucky enough to have been selected in the ballot to receive a free housing unit. What is interesting is that when you see this project from the top, this way of selecting beneficiaries from the top down, it is perfect, right? It is It is technocratic, it is not biased, it avoids local corruption. But when the projects were implemented, especially in small cities like Granada, and this I heard from people who worked on this, is that they created a lot of tension. So when people saw the list of the potential beneficiaries, they saw many people who did not live in the cities, right? Because they were familiar with those who were listed. So they saw people who did not live there. They saw people who did not own, who already owned a house, and they did not see people listed that they thought really needed housing. So this created a lot of tensions that people tried to address to mayors, but mayors could not do anything about it because the list came from the top. So their hands were tied. So having given that story, I think, I don't have all the answers, but I think it was a mistake to, because I know the idea was to avoid local corruption by defining the list from the top. But I think in these scenarios, you need to have, I know it's difficult, but you need to have more participation in the selection process. You need to get the local communities involved and try to identify with the communities what would be a better way of identifying people, because also this created a stigma for the free housing units. So because people live in these units with very bad public image, they feel compelled to try to demonstrate their legitimacy to a free housing units, or actually they start evaluating the legitimacy of their neighbors, all of which is contributing to creating these social tensions. I hope that answers the question.
There's also a couple of questions here I'm going to combine related to the role of design. A question from Sarah Radomirovic. Architecture shapes our behavior. Do you think that these projects should be different so that displaced communities won't stay displaced? In other words, people remaining poor. And if yes, what are your professional advices as an urbanist about how these developments can better promote, I guess, economic advancement? And related to that is a question from Gabe Colombo, who says, are there any design factors you've noticed that contribute to neighborhood social cohesion or lack thereof?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about design. I'm not a designer, so I don't feel that comfortable proposing a design model. But what I saw as a social scientist is that projects were not delivered with the whole things that were promised. So for example, in Macatoa, projects were not delivered with a connection to the gas system to their homes. The project was not delivered to with a community center. This created a lot of tensions with neighbors because things were promised and they were not delivered, and then some of them got gas connections through other means, and that created a lot of tension. So promising things that are not being delivered, and people get frustrated. So yeah, bad. Now, more related to design. So there's the example that I gave about the motorcycles and where do you locate parking. What I've learned from different projects I've seen is that parking is always going to be problematic. So I guess designers should pay more attention to how they define parking, and probably it's good to inquire with the community. How would parking be better adjusted to the needs of the community? Because in some cases you have the communities that use cars, in some cases that you have communities that use motorcycles. So the parking requirements are very diverse, and usually designers, or in general, like these construction companies, use the same model for parking everywhere, and that messes things up, as you can see in the example that I gave. Other thing is that, but this would be more in terms of allowing flexibility, because yeah, sometimes houses are designed in a way and communities do not like that, and they change it, and that works for their best. So allowing for flexibility is good, but taking into account that there might be some issues about not enforcing the rules. So yeah, that would be
great. There's also a question here from someone who is from a small village, Gorata, I'm going to mess his last name up, Kafela, who is from Africa, a small village. And he says, his question for you is it perhaps convenient for the government that this differentiation and disharmony in these communities helps to justify the lack of provision of social amenities? So I guess in some sense, is the failure here somewhat purposeful to, I'm sure Maria Paula would take exception.
That is mean intended. I don't know. Well, I know there are many issues, but I don't think in the general design of the program there is mean intention. I think there are some issues that you can find in the process of implementation, where, for example, the gas connections in Macatoa, that was for sure corruptions of, from the, well, not for sure because I don't have the evidence, but that smell corruption in there. But in terms of the general design, no, I don't think so, because imagine it required for me a whole year of field work figuring out this. I don't think a public official will do the same. So I don't think so, but who knows?
There's another question from Juan David Guirisales, who asks about the dynamics of neighborhood collective spaces where they could potentially come together, even if informal. Soccer fields, parks, open spaces, and maybe this gets to the design question. You know, I wonder if you found any potential for integration of the community outside of the actual home.
Yeah, so in terms of the collective spaces, that was an issue of these units, because collective spaces were not provided. So that was a huge issue. So communities had to meet on the street. And Granada is super hot, it's humid, so imagine people had to meet at night. Some of them didn't want to go at night. So it was a huge issue. Interestingly, some of the informal settlements were more successful creating these spaces for themselves. So one of my informal settlements I studied create a beautiful, well, maybe if you see it, you will not see it beautiful, but for me it was beautiful what they accomplished in their neighbors. I guess it's because they had more flexibility in terms of the land tenure. So yeah, I think that's a problem, and maybe a problem that is bigger in the smaller cities, because in large cities, the construction companies and the cities themselves have more money to invest in these spaces, whereas in small cities, they don't. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if you see that in small cities lack the public amenities in greater quantity. In terms of integration, yeah, I don't see much. I try to, so what was interesting was that they were not discriminated against in terms of being displaced, and people did not felt discriminated for being displaced. But in terms of organizing with other neighbors, they were already having a huge trouble organizing by themselves. So when I actually try to suggest to some of them, why don't you organize with your immediate neighbors to get a community center for all of you? So they will give you some social capital to demand the city to construct this for you, and they were not willing, because they were already having a lot of social tensions within them. So it was difficult. I don't know, was that your question, Chris?
Oh, well, it wasn't my question, so in our format, it's hard for us to go back to the questioner, but I think you addressed it. So they can jump in back in the Q&A if they want to follow up. Barata did ask another question, which relates to this question about community engagement, and he was interested in knowing the type of participatory processes in place for the government to have a platform for the community to engage in. So I guess, what kind of, and you mentioned that there were some meetings where they would come together, and so were there participatory processes that either the government could facilitate to create that community building, or what was that kind of social infrastructure?
Yeah, so there were some participatory processes, and also participatory institutions that that the residents So when the residents, when the projects become a neighborhood, as I mentioned in the presentation, every neighborhood in Colombia has a right to conform these local community boards. So these local community boards can, for example, request resources from local authorities to develop local action plans, and they are conformed in terms of that there is a president of the local community board, and there is other leaders in the local community board. So that's a participatory process in itself, which is very important for Colombia. And that applied to these two neighborhoods. One problem with that process is that it created a lot of frictions between the residents. So there were a lot of fights. So for example, in Macatoa, previous leaders of the local community board were against the new leaders, and that divided the neighborhood and actually impeded things from happening in the neighborhood. So sadly, in this case, what has been a very good example of participatory creation of institutionality actually work against the residents, but I wouldn't blame it on the participatory tool itself. Other means for participatory action. So, well, I think the government did fail inviting citizens and inviting residents to participate to community meetings before the projects were established. I think that could have helped communities to better imagine their futures and organizing. What other participatory schemes? No, and there were the government also, when the government realized that these tensions were happening, the government also created from the national level a program to support the communities of the free housing projects, to support their social relations and participation. So there were usually organized meetings with the public officials, between the public officials and the communities, where public officials would try to address all the concerns of residents, which was a good effort. Maybe it started too late, and also with a new presidency, it was cut. So I guess it didn't finish its purpose, maybe.
Good. Maria Paula had another question that she put in, and she was talking about the fact that she agrees that these kind of rules that were established not being enforced. She felt like there was some issue too with families coming from rural areas, moving to urban areas, different styles of living. And so her question was, do you think the families could have better adapted to these housing projects, this new mode of living, or maybe they need better housing solutions that are more sensitive to their needs and the context they're coming from?
Yeah, I think there's, first in Colombia, we need a better rural housing policy. That's clear, and that's evidence in the problems that we see with the free housing projects, because free housing projects were designed only for urban areas. So there were many cases where people coming from rural areas got a free housing unit, and they felt forced to move to live in the free housing units, because if you don't live there, the government can take the unit away from you. And yeah, I did interview many residents who were not happy, who would prefer to move back to the rural areas. They could not work in the cities. Their skills were for the rural areas. They missed the rural areas. So this was not good for them. And I think it's more the result of a lack of housing, a lack of policy for rural areas. And also the definition of this policy. Yeah, maybe you could, instead of forcing people to move to urban areas, you could give them a support to acquire land in more rural areas. I think is that an answer?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question from Johan Day from Haiti. He was asking, are there prospective communities of IDPs involved at all in the process of designing or conceptualizing the communities where they expected to live? Is there from the get-go, people are having input. They may have feedback ahead of time to help avoid issues of social cohesion, etc. Are there any examples of that in Colombia? Or?
Yeah, I've heard of one, but I'm not familiar, but I think in most cases there were not. So that's a great question. I think there was one, but I'm not that familiar, so I cannot really speak about it. But yeah, I guess part of the problem is that there is no real participation. So, and especially, yeah, in these small cities, that could make a difference.
Yeah, I'm actually seeing now that Ruth Mora asked a similar question. So Ruth, Ruth just added the comment, asking the community to self-organize is important, but they don't necessarily have the tools to do so as well. So she's asking about a public consultation process. I think that's related to the question you just answered, but.
Yeah, and maybe also through the like institutionalized system of participation that yeah, the local community boards, but the issue is that the local community board can become a means of even fracturing more the community. So I think it's good to think of well, there's need to be a consultation processes with these communities of how do you become a leader of a community board. But it's interesting because in the informal, so I don't want to romanticize informal settlements. Informal settlements have a lot of problems too, but they were so much successful organizing, and their backgrounds were the same, and they organized by themselves. They don't have any guidance from public authorities. So maybe it's not a top-down thing. It's more about the environment you create for social organization.
I want to go back, ask my own question, some of the time we have left, but you started out, you said that you have an interest in unexpected cases and situations where we take things for granted and there are unintended consequences, and what are the lessons? So in this case, what did they take for granted, and what were the unintended consequences? Was it they took for granted the possession of these rules, and how would you frame that?
I frame that in different ways. So one is in the more academic way. So is what the literature usually writes about and what we expect, and what we find in certain situations that do not abide by the rules. So that's why I like this, or I'm trying to push for this focus on small cities, because what we generally read about is the problems of isolation. But in small cities, the problems of there doesn't seem to be a problem. So even though you have concentrated situations of concentrated disadvantage, also in city peripheries, you don't see the problems of isolation that you see portrayed in the literature. So that's why I like to bring a different image, and let's say, let's not talk only about isolation, or where do we talk about isolation and where do we talk about different things. So in small cities, it seems that the histories of displacement and what people are familiar with seem to matter a lot in how they end up organizing. So these were kind of the things that I like to controvert.
I didn't read the paper itself, but I did read the blog that David Luberoff wrote about the paper you did with Diane Davis in Bogota, which is also an interesting example of perhaps unintended consequences in terms of the design of that project. I know it's not the focus of your talk today. Could you say a little bit about that context and that as an example of this, what was taken for granted and what the result was?
You mean translate that to this example?
Or as another example of that, I thought that I'm kind of bringing in that paper a little bit, but I thought that was another example, a good example, it seems.
Oh, yeah.
What was taken for granted and what the unintended consequences were, but in a different context. So. Yeah,
in a different context. So in the paper, the argument is that, oh, well, I will try to super summarize this, but
maybe this isn't fair to you, but.
No, but it's okay. It's like that there are these progressive policies that we all think they are important. So these progressive policies of creating social integration and of a car-free city. So we all are up for those policies. But when you see it in implementations, they create some social tensions that we need to take into account. So for example, in the case of car-free cities, that is this idea that we all love and support, at least planners. In the study in Bogota that Chris is referring to, the government did not deliver parking when they delivered the housing units, and that created a lot of tensions between neighbors, and also residents felt cheated by the government. And there's also an issue of social equity, because whereas all the housing project, the private residents had 2 and 3 parking slots per unit, they didn't have one. So there's also an issue of equity that was in tension with the idea of not providing parking because we want a car-free city. So that's a very rough summary, but yeah, that's kind of the approach I like to take to my research, and I think that's how qualitative research can contribute. That's one way in which qualitative research can contribute to generalizable knowledge.
Yeah, you know, and it strikes me too that I think that we often have, as you say, kind of idealistic progressive views, and through this development, we will come to realize those. But in fact, these are living, breathing communities that will live as they will live. And so, you know, you may say having no parking, therefore people will have no cars, therefore we'll have less carbon footprint. But if in point in fact, people need vehicles to get around, they're still going to have them. So design has to not just, can't overstep the way people live. And I think in the example of your developments in Granada, the kind of the motorbikes parking in front of the house, the fact that businesses are being run out of the house, that these things can't be legislated away through design or through rules.
Yeah, design needs to incorporate that in their own plan. So this is going to change. Yeah.
Right. There was one last question in the Q&A, and I don't know if you have an answer to this because I think your research was done before the pandemic is, but what do you think the impact of the ongoing pandemic has had on displaced persons in public housing, or will have overall? Do you discover any health implications for displaced persons of these housing situations?
Yeah, I haven't done research, so I try to follow up. So I was planning to go to Colombia actually this year, but not able. Actually, I got COVID, so I experienced the whole thing. I've been trying to be in contact with the residents through WhatsApp. And so first, Granada has about 150 cases of COVID, so it's not that much. And it's a small city, people do not need public transportation, people move in motorcycles or bikes. So contagion is not that critical. You can argue that the problem of not hygiene, but not access to water, that can be a problem in terms of people cannot wash their hands. So people in Granada, they construct water wells. So usually water wells are more reliable than the aqueduct. So people take their water from water wells, and in the summer, water dries a lot. So sometimes the wells dry and they don't have access to water. So that could be impacting negatively in terms of the capacity of residents to wash their hands frequently. I don't think there is much access to hand sanitizer. So in that sense, it would impact them. I would say the impact would be larger in the case of Granada, not in the case of a large city like Bogota, but in case of Granada in terms of the economy. So jobs, I think people will suffer and are suffering a lot from losing their jobs, not being able to sell food on the streets. Many of them are vendors, daily vendors who sell arepas, like cornbread on the streets, that probably they are not being able to do that. So in that sense, I would say they are being hit harder, but Granada is not the case of a spread of the disease.
Right. Maria, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for a terrific presentation, really thoughtful discussion. You know, our work at the Joint Center is often in some ways for being very distant and looking at facts and numbers, and really love the kind of qualitative work and understanding the ways in which people actually live in housing and the importance of policy and design for trying to create successful communities. And so you clearly have added to our understanding of these issues. So I really appreciate you sharing your work. I'm really glad you're a Meyer Fellow. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. This event will be recorded and posted on our website. So if you want to share it with family and friends, it'll live on. So Thank you, Maria. Thank you all. Be well and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.